the recent bids by the PA to the UN Security Council to set a timeline for the end of Israeli occupation and its recent signing of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. There has been much debate about the efficacy and timing of these measures, while acknowledging that they are, in theory, good measures to take. In reality, they raise many questions and involve many challenges to implement on the ground. Will they bring a more positive outcome to the Palestinian people? Will they actually bring Israeli officials before the ICC? What are the likely challenges that will be involved in such proceedings? Our speakers will talk about these questions and more. Phyllis Bennis, who will be our first speaker, she directs the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies and is a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She has been a writer, analyst, and activist on Middle East and UN issues for many years. In 2001, she helped found and remains on the advisory board of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. She writes and speaks widely across the U.S. and around the world as part of the Global Peace Movement. And she continues to serve as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East and UN democratization issues. Among her many books, and we have some of them for sale here, she's author of Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power, and Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer. This is, by the way, $10, and these books are for sale up front. She's also co-editor of Beyond the Storm, a Gulf Crisis reader, and Altered States, a reader in the New World Order. So please, if you're interested in these books, we're selling them up front for $10 and $15. Our next speaker, Ambassador Philip Wilcox, retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in 1997 after a 31-year career and was president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace until 2014. He previously served as press attaché in Vientiane, Laos, political and economic commercial officer in Jakarta, Indonesia, and chief of the economic commercial section in Dhaka, Bangladesh. His last overseas assignment was as chief of mission and consul general in Jerusalem. Ambassador Wilcox served as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary for Management, Deputy Director for UN Political Affairs in the Bureau of International Organizational Affairs, and as Director for Regional Affairs in the Bureau for Middle Eastern and South Asian Affairs. He has held the positions of Director for Israeli and Arab-Israeli Affairs and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Middle Eastern Affairs, among many other posts. So I believe now we can just start with our first speaker, Phyllis Bennis. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Samira, and thank you all for coming out on this very cold day. I wanted to start just because on the way over here I heard something rather extraordinary that I thought I should share, which had to do with a hearing that's going on of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which of course now is chaired by Senator John McCain. And the hearing today had to do with global security issues, and the honored guest who was being featured was one Henry Kissinger. Not surprisingly, there were some protesters who came to say, you know, they didn't think this was very appropriate. And what Senator McCain chose to do, rather than either saying, as others have in that situation, you know, the reason that we need to fight is to defend the right of free speech, even to terrible speech like this, or to say something like, well, whatever, or to say, guards, please, you know, keep these people quiet or something. Instead, what did he say was, get out of here, you low-life scum. So I just thought it was too classic an opening, the first hearing of the new Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So I thought I would share that. I mean, we need to laugh about something because the situation in the region we're here to talk about is very, very dire and not getting better anytime soon. There are new dangers as well as existing dangers. The dangers of a war expanding to the Israeli-Lebanon border is very real with the fighting that's gone on in the last day or two. It's a very dangerous moment. And what we're here to talk about today in terms of the initiatives at the United Nations, we should be clear, none of these initiatives are going to change that dire situation on the ground anytime soon. That doesn't mean they're not important, but it does mean that anybody who thinks that this is going to be, quote, the answer is going to be sorely disappointed. So I think, first of all, from my vantage point, it's important to distinguish the two components that Samira spoke of and that we're here to talk about. The effort to get a resolution at the Security Council that would end the Israeli occupation is one thing. Membership in the International Criminal Court, the ICC, is something very different. So both, I think, are important. As I said, neither would have ended the occupation. But both do something very important, even when they fail, which is to internationalize the issue, to make clear that those responsible for solving this are not found in Washington, that maintaining the current assumption that only negotiations under the thumb of Washington is going to work is belied by 24 years of failure, and every indication that another 5 years will make it 29 years of failure. So by internationalizing the issue, internationalizing the question, one of the things that happens is that it undermines the legitimacy that should never have been there of that U.S.-led diplomacy. That was never going to work, and it should never have been given the imprimatur of the world's approval, the creation of the so-called quartet, which was never a quartet. It was a solo with 3 backup singers, you know. I mean, the idea that you have a quartet where you have the United States, Russia, only because it was almost the end of the Cold War, and the United Nations, which includes the United States and Russia, and Europe, which includes, I think it's 23 countries now, that are also members of the United Nations. It never made any sense unless you understood it as a way of giving a political credential to a unilateral U.S. move, which is precisely what it was. So what's important about this, and I'll speak first of the resolution around ending the occupation. It was a very weak resolution. If it had passed, it would have given the imprimatur of the United Nations Security Council to a pseudo-state that did not have territorial contiguity, that did not have control of its own borders, did not have control of its own airspace, did not control its own waters, had control of none of its own resources, had no independent way of bringing people or goods in or out without the continuing approval of Israel. It did nothing to demolish the settlements. So it was not anything that we would write home about. Really what it did was say, we would recommend that the U.S.-banked negotiations should go forward again and that they should be done in a year. Well, that's all very nice, but the U.S. negotiations were never going to do anything anyway. So it was really kind of a fraud. And you might wonder, well, why was it that the U.S. pushed so hard to make sure it didn't pass if it was such a fraud? The answer is what I said first. It delegitimizes U.S. control simply to have it under the auspices of the United Nations. So that had become very important. The fact that Europe, in particular, changed its long-standing willingness to stand by the U.S. in this situation was very important. The fact that France, which said, we don't even like this resolution very much, but we're going to vote for it because we think it's important that something break the momentum of this U.S. failure, that was important. The fact that the United Kingdom abstained instead of voting for it was a very important statement. And it almost was a statement that what is needed is an entirely different kind of diplomacy that's based on international law and the primacy of the United Nations, rather than one based on Israeli power and the continuing power of the United States. And I would say that part of the reason that Europe voted the way they did is because European countries have been flooded with enormous and powerful and creative BDS campaigns. The campaign known as Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is a global campaign initiated by Palestinian civil society, has had enormous impact across Europe. Economic impact, with the cancellation of major projects and major contracts. So that's been huge, and that's a big part of the reason why European governments are changing their opinion. Now, it had no enforcement. It was not proposed under either Chapter 6 or Chapter 7, which would have allowed for sanctions to be imposed if there were violations. None of that was there. There was no consequence that was included. So the resolution was never was never something that was going to change the situation on the ground. But it's also true that it was never going to pass, because the U.S. is determined that the United Nations not be the venue for solving this long-standing problem. Washington has to be the venue. The State Department, 5 blocks away from here. That's where we have to solve it. And we know how successful they've been. So this is part of the problem. Now, what do we think was going on? There's this claim that the U.S. didn't veto, that it doesn't count as a veto because the U.S. voted no, but it didn't have, the resolution didn't have the 9 votes necessary to pass, and it didn't pass only because of the U.S. veto. Well, that's the technical definition. But in the real world, the U.S. vetoed it. What does that mean? The U.S. prevented it from passing. Now, you can debate, UN resolutions and whatever, but in the real world, it was the U.S. that made sure it didn't pass. How did they do that? Well, the usual ways. There's something at the United Nations that's called the Yemen precedent. It started in 1990 at the time that the first Bush administration was desperately trying to get a unanimous vote in the Security Council to endorse war against Iraq. There were 2 countries that were saying no. One was Cuba, that opposed it on principle. The other was Yemen, the only Arab country on the Security Council. And Yemen had just been reunified after a long civil war. There was no way they were going to endorse the invasion of another Arab country. Yemen voted no. And no sooner had Abdullah al-Ashtal put down his hand than the U.S. ambassador was at his side saying, that will be the most expensive no vote you ever cast. And sure enough, 3 days later, the U.S. cut its entire aid budget to Yemen. In the meantime, the remark was picked up on an open microphone. And a lot of people said, oh, it's so careless. He shouldn't have ever said it, blah, blah, blah. I don't think so. I think that he said it deliberately, knowing that the microphone was open, because the message wasn't really about Yemen. The message was to the rest of the world. You cross us on an issue that's important to us, and you will pay a price. Yemen paid the price, and that became something that they still talk about at the UN, known as the Yemen precedent, which is this use of raw power to punish, bribe, threaten other countries. So we had the Yemen precedent well underway here. Now, one of the aspects of that was Nigeria. Until the moment of the vote, everybody thought Nigeria was going to vote for the resolution. At the end of the day, Nigeria abstained. Why? Well, among other things, they had gotten phone calls the night before from both John Kerry and Bibi Netanyahu, and at midnight from President Obama directly to Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan. Now, what did they talk about? I wasn't a fly on the wall in that meeting. You'd have to talk to the NSA, who got the wiretaps. But I can imagine that the issues of Israeli weapons that Nigeria has been buying was on the agenda, that U.S. purchases of Nigerian oil was probably on the agenda. There's a lot of pressure points, and I have no doubt that any of them were used. So, no surprise, it didn't pass. But, again, this was a very weak resolution, was not going to have much impact. Now, the International Criminal Court, that's a different matter. There, we're talking about something that is going, in the future, not yet, is going to have some real impact here. The idea that Palestine is now a member of the International Criminal Court is something that has been greeted with outrage in the halls of the U.S. Congress, the State Department, the White House, the Pentagon, and a bunch of other countries allied with the U.S. The U.S. and Canada issued almost identical statements of outrage. They're called communication statements that are filed with the United Nations as part of the treaty. They're considered sort of amendments to the treaty, which we should note the U.S., of course, is not a member of. It's signed but never ratified. So what the U.S. and Canada said was that that they don't believe that Palestine is a state, and therefore this is not something we can take seriously because they have no right to join the Rome Treaty, the Treaty of the International Criminal Court. Now, you would sort of think that since the General Assembly of the United Nations decided that Palestine is indeed a state in the context of international law, that the U.S. and Canada, for once, might sort of say, maybe we should keep our mouth shut just because, hello, the rest of the world made another decision. But no, humility has not ever really been popular around here or apparently in Ottawa these days. So they were out there saying, we don't accept this. Really? Well, really? Who cares? That's one part of the answer, because you're not members of the court anyway. Why should your opinion matter? Well, it matters because we're talking about the United States, the bully of the world. So the Yemen precedent is something particular to the United Nations, but there is no question that it works in other arenas as well. I was in Rome at the time the Rome Treaty was being negotiated. I wasn't there for the whole time, but I was there for the beginning, the first 2 weeks. And it was an astonishing thing to see. The U.S., which everybody knew, was not ever going to sign that treaty, was not ever going to vote for that treaty at that point. This is in 1998. The U.S. had the biggest delegation there. There were more than 200 U.S. diplomats. Now, no offense to U.S. diplomats. Some of my close friends are U.S. diplomats or former U.S. diplomats. But these guys had a very specific assignment, which is to undermine and weaken the court as much as you can. And the way they did it was very surreptitious. It was all, listen, if you just change that one piece of the language, maybe we could get the U.S. to vote for it. If you just weaken this one part of the jurisdiction, maybe we can get the U.S. on board. If you just change one part of, just narrow what crimes are under the jurisdiction of the court, maybe we could do it. And somehow, God love them, some of these diplomats from around the world fell for it. You know, there were a few of us running around saying, you don't really believe this, do you? But, you know, it worked. There are 200 people who were stalking everywhere. They were in the bathrooms. They were in the smoking rooms. They were in the coffee rooms. They were everywhere. You couldn't blink without falling over a U.S. diplomat, you know? They were everywhere. And it worked. I don't think you were there, Phil. It worked. The court that was created was and is highly politicized, highly weakened relative to what it might have been, but it is an incredibly important step forward. What we've seen since that time has been a vast expansion of the idea of international law having a legitimate role to play in the political world. So you have the Pinochet precedent, something to really cheer about, not like the Yemen precedent. The Pinochet precedent proved that a sitting head of state that had just left office could be held accountable for the actions that he took during his time as head of state. Now, unfortunately, he had to go and die before he could actually be jailed. But he was held under house arrest. This was huge. This was huge. And this set a precedent for what international law, international jurisdiction could look like. So, similarly, the notion of Palestine being a member of the International Criminal Court becomes a huge potential for the future. Now, the court is an independent agency. The prosecutor of the court has the right to make her own decisions about what investigations she will launch. Palestine is going to present an official request to the court to initiate an investigation. We don't know exactly what will be included. Presumably, it will include the ongoing violation known as the settlement process, which is an ongoing violation of international law and the Geneva Conventions, something that is included in the Rome Statute. It will also presumably include some of the specific war crimes that were committed last summer against Gaza, that involved collective punishment, that involved targeting of civilians, etc. Now, how that happens, you know, we don't know that for sure. Palestine can ask for an investigation. We don't know that it's going to come forward as we would like. There are enormous restrictions. Complementarity is one restriction, meaning that the court is designed only to complement the investigations carried out by the government itself. If the Israeli government, and it makes the claim that it's investigating, so many things are being investigated in Tel Aviv, you know, we never hear the end of the investigations. They never really happen, but we hear that. That could become an excuse to not have the court intervene because the Israelis are doing it themselves. The Security Council can stop an investigation launched by the court. Now, that would not be easy. It's one thing for the U.S. to veto something in the Council. It's another thing for it to be able to get sufficient votes to pass it. So there's a lot of potential dangers. The U.S. has forced 100 or more, but at least 100 countries to sign resolutions that are known as Article 98 agreements. And what they say basically is it's an agreement between the United States and all those governments that promise that that government will never turn over any U.S. officials, political or military officials, who might be indicted by the court to the court. So it was known as the Invade the Hague law when it was passed in the United States, that said that the U.S. would invade any country that tries to hold a U.S. official accountable. So we should be immune from any accountability. The rest of the world should. So finally, and I want to end in just a minute so we have plenty of time for discussion and conversation and questions. The question of what do we really need here? We should, number one, be cheering that Palestine, whether we think it's the right governmental processes or not, Palestine has put itself under the jurisdiction not only of the International Criminal Court, but of the important human rights treaties like the Treaty on the Rights of the Disabled, the rights of women, the rights of children, the Geneva Conventions, all of these things. The Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian government itself has said Palestine is going to hold itself accountable. That's something to cheer about. That's a good thing. For Palestinians who live under what is often a very repressive set of governments in the occupied territories, that by itself is a good thing. But it's most important for the possibility of being able to hold the Israeli officials accountable for their violations of international law that have everything to do with occupation and apartheid. How is that going to play out? It might be in the context of the General Assembly moving on under the Uniting for Peace precedent that allows it to substitute for the Security Council when the Security Council is paralyzed by a U.S. veto or threat of veto. But at the end of the day, this is all about political will. That's what's going to enable Palestine to end its occupation and apartheid. It's not going to come from Washington. It's not ultimately going to come from New York. It's going to come because it's going to cost too much for Israel to maintain its own occupation and apartheid. This is where it's going to be like South Africa, where at a certain point in South Africa, white South Africans started to realize that this apartheid system was not cost-free. For South Africans, it had everything to do with sports. When the white South Africans realized that their beloved Springboks could no longer play in the World Cup because of apartheid, suddenly it began to change. Now, Israelis, it's not so much about sports. You know, there's a reason, like when I was, well, never mind. Jews are not so big on sports. When I was in high school, the only team that ever won anything was the chess team. It's not about sports. It's about science and culture. When Israelis start realizing that they're not getting to see the musicians, the poets, the writers, the theater groups that they want to see because they're boycotting it under the call of BDS, that's going to change the situation on the ground. What we need to do here is for every moment be challenging what our government is doing in claiming that it has the right to say the International Criminal Court is irrelevant, Palestine has no basis being there, the UN is not allowed to be the venue for any solution, and to stop how the United States enables Israeli occupation and Israeli apartheid through $3.1 billion of military aid every year and providing impunity at the United Nations and in the International Criminal Court. That's our job. Thank you.
The agency, I think, in the U.S. government that was most resolutely opposed to the creation of the International Criminal Court, much less U.S. accession, was the Department of Defense. Because the U.S. is, alas, and has been involved too often in foreign military conflict. And the Defense Department, which is perhaps the most powerful and well-funded agency in the U.S. government, wanted no part of any statute which might, even theoretically, criminalize the behavior of American soldiers. I'll say a few words about the UN Security Council, a forum in which the U.S. had a major role in creating when the UN was founded after World War II, at a time when our leadership was committed to the idea of a more rule-based international system in which international law and the UN would play an important part. Alas, there has been a progressive retreat from that over the recent decades, and the U.S., as a great power, does not normally accept the limitations of international law when it finds something to be manifestly in its vital interest. Now, the interesting thing to me about the failure of the Security Council resolution on settlements back in November. No, I'm sorry, about the failure of the Security Council resolution in December, which was designed to set a deadline for successful negotiations and peace, was that as the initial what they call them blue lines, the drafts were introduced, the State Department spokesman said something which I found quite remarkable. She said, the U.S. Does not, words to the effect, regard action by the UN Security Council as unilateral, which was the charge that had been leveled against the UN Security Council meddling in the affairs of Israel and Palestine. And she said, we will await the text and have a look at it. That was astonishing because even before any drafts have been initiated in the past, the U.S. has always said the Security Council has no right to address this problem. What that suggests to me is that somehow, remarkably, the seventh floor in the State Department had an open mind about this and just might have been willing to engage in drafting and supporting a decent Security Council resolution. But my hunch is that as soon as it got up to a higher level, and you know where that is, the answer was no. So we reverted to what we have done for the past 30 years. There was a time when the U.S. did engage on such resolutions with great success, and we, as a permanent member of the United Nations, as a great power, have enormous influence in shaping resolutions that would protect our interests and protect the interests of other nations as well. We didn't do it. Phyllis mentioned the General Assembly's procedure called Uniting for Peace. It's an arcane, seldom used measure, but in short, if one nation vetoes a Security Council resolution, the General Assembly is authorized to take up the same issue and adopt the decision that the Security Council might have adopted, and it will have binding authority. The Palestinians may have this in mind in their statement that they want to go back to the Security Council sometime early this year. There is a new Security Council. It changes its complexion every year, as you know, because of votes for representatives among non-member states. And the new Security Council, has a slightly and more, I would say, progressive, non-aligned complexion than the previous one, and it's not certain that the U.S. could prevent a 9-state majority that would enable a full vote on a Security Council resolution. I don't know whether the Palestinians are going to do that. They may indeed want to trigger the Uniting for Peace resolution so that they could use the UN effectively on their behalf. There's another method of internationalization which no one knows very much about that could cause great difficulties for the United States, and that is the accession by the state of Palestine to 15 or 20 UN specialized agencies. I'm thinking of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Civil Aviation Organization, UNIDO, and several dozen others. The Palestinians did so, but in a very limited way. They joined UNESCO, and quickly the United States government stopped paying its dues to UNESCO because believe it or not, the U.S. Congress has adopted legislation that says that if the Palestinian Authority joins any of these specialized agencies, the U.S. will withdraw its funding. Normally, when the U.S. withdraws its funding, some months or maybe it takes a year, the United States will no longer be a member of these organizations. It is unlikely that the U.S. would ever allow this to happen, and would have to amend its legislation or provide some kind of a waiver if the Palestinians do it. Let me turn to the ICC bid. I am deeply skeptical that this will produce tangible results because of the complexity of the statute, the very limited jurisdiction that it imposes, that it can impose on conflicts, and the political issue involved. This is the most fraught, volatile, sensitive international issue that I can imagine, and I have grave doubts that the ICC, a relatively new institution, by the way, it's not a UN institution, would want to take this on, because the court has had very little success in its decade of existence. It has received thousands of complaints. It's acted on almost none of them. It has convicted only 2 individuals of war crimes, the Congolese warlords. A case that appeared to be succeeding against the president of Kenya failed, and so it has a very poor track record, and that does not engender a lot of respect or support for the court. And they do aspire ultimately to the U.S. Accepting the Rome Statute, and I think they are wary of provoking the United States by accepting jurisdiction, by investigating and prosecuting a case against Israel. But one has to understand that there is certainly nothing illegitimate about the Palestinians joining the ICC. They are a state as recognized by the General Assembly. They have a perfect right to do so. They probably would not have done so because they had been warned in advance by the U.S. that we might be obliged to impose sanctions against the Palestinian Authority. We might indeed withdraw our aid. But they saw no other avenue to pursue their cause, having failed for over 20 years to gain anything through bilateral negotiations, during which the Israeli policy of settlement and occupation of the occupied territories has created what many believe is now an irreversible situation. So the Palestinians played along with negotiations. They negotiated seriously for a long time, but they got nothing out of it. The Palestinians, I think, now realize that political violence is not an effective weapon in this conflict, particularly with the state of Israel. And so there has been a grassroots movement of nonviolence among Palestinians. That has failed. I can't say that it's failed permanently, but it really hasn't made any difference or struck the conscience of the Israeli public and the Israeli leadership. So Abu Mazen was under great pressure to do something, having failed to achieve Palestinian liberation through conventional means. And he said, well, I'm going to internationalize. And so he has done so. Does that mean that the conflict now has become an international conflict in which the international community will assert its will and prevail? No, it doesn't. But there is, as Phyllis said, real symbolic significance to the Palestinians joining this agency, and the public relations gain that they will achieve is not trivial. However, it will hardly be decisive, have virtually no impact on the situation on the ground. Well, the U.S. opposed this because, as Phyllis said, it still presumes that it is the only great power that can serve as a mediator between the two parties. We have proclaimed that privilege for many decades now, yet we have not fulfilled the normal duties and obligations of a good faith mediator and peacemaker. We have deferred increasingly over the last 30 years to Israeli government policy. It wasn't always that way. Back in the 1970s, even into the early 80s, the UN would accept UN Security Council jurisdiction and actually voted for some resolutions that were critical of Israeli policy. But since then, almost invariably, with a few exceptions, the U.S. supported a Security Council censure of the Israeli bombing of the Osirak reactor in Iraq, and in a few other cases. But almost uniformly, it decided that the Security Council had no business in dealing with this. Is that going to be a permanent feature of U.S. policy? I don't know. I think not, because the current Israeli policies are becoming increasingly untenable. Israel has been increasingly isolated as a pariah state because of its policies of occupation and settlement, which are utterly incompatible with the rules of international behavior in the 21st century. And the U.S., as the guarantor and underwriter of Israel, has lost real credibility because of this policy. So this policy will change ultimately. The question is, how long will it take? Well, in the meantime, what are the chances for success in the ICC? They're very limited for various complex reasons, but I will mention two. If the Palestinians tend to decide to focus on settlements, it's not clear whether they're going after settlements or war crimes in Gaza first, but the press seems to emphasize their desire to press the Gaza claims. There will be counterclaims by the Israelis. The Palestinian Authority is technically one authority that governs all of Palestine, including Gaza. And the Israelis will claim that the Gazans were carrying out war crimes with missiles aimed against the civilian populace in Israel. So that is a problem which will dissuade the court from a full-scale investigation. On settlements, the statute says that the situation which the court addresses must take place on the land of the plaintiff, on the territory of the plaintiff. There has never been an international definition of the territory of the Palestinian state, and I doubt seriously that the ICC would want to take upon themselves the responsibility for defining the borders between Israel and Palestine. The other one is that the statute appears to prevent retroactive jurisdiction over events that have taken place in the past. Those that it has jurisdiction for, according to the letter of the statute, are those that take place after the signature of the Rome Statute by the complaining state. So my prediction is that the ICC will not decide to carry out a full-scale investigation. It is already doing a temporary investigation, and it cannot do a full-scale one for another 30 days. It's too far, too ambitious a reach for the ICC at this stage. Well, has it helped Israel? I mentioned the public relations advantage at this stage, but essentially it will do nothing for the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, a state of their own. And the prospect for accomplishing this in the long run, it will happen. But in the long run, as someone has said, we'll all be dead. And the interval between the change in American and international policy, if we don't change it sooner, will be full of mayhem and tragedy and disaster for Palestinians and Israelis, and in some cases the rest of the world. And that makes it all the more urgent that we change our policy sooner than later. Will we do it? Not, I think, during this administration, when the administration, while rhetorically supporting Palestinian equities and a rapid turn toward peace and opposing settlements, has done virtually nothing to change that situation. And while it complains sometimes bitterly against Israeli policy, it has never made it clear to the state of Israel that there are consequences for their behavior, and that it is jeopardizing our relationship with them. They will not change their policy until it becomes clear to them that they're losing favor and support from their best and only friend. So that's the challenge. It's just conceivable that Obama might decide in the last 2 years to try once again. But he has been thwarted in the past. He has been advised by everyone within his inner circle that he shouldn't touch this. It's a hornet's nest, and we have always failed where we tried energetically to do so in the past. There's another obstacle here too, and that is the Palestinians, who are a divided community. And if the Palestinians are to prevail in the end, they have to develop a new and credible strategy. They have to unite the two wings of the Palestinian national movement. Otherwise, the Israelis will not take them seriously. I think nor will the rest of the world. And for the Palestinians to assume that whatever their lack of strategy or vision, the U.S., the international community, is going to rush to their aid is not true. So there's a big challenge, an internal challenge for the Palestinian Authority. So I wish I could offer something more optimistic to you, but that's the way it looks to me. Now, history can change. Israel is a volatile country. Elections are being held on March 17th. There is a maybe 48%, 46% chance that a more pragmatic and moderate government will come to power. Even if it does, that is not unlikely to make a big change in the current policies of occupation and settlement, because those policies are so deeply entrenched with Israel, and because to change those policies and reverse the situation would require an enormous convulsion, a transformation of the modern state of Israel, and that is unlikely to take place until the Israeli public and leadership understands that the future of their country is at stake, and they have not yet grasped that, in large part because the U.S. has consistently rushed to their aid even when it doesn't serve U.S. interests, and adopted a policy of impunity, which has created the illusion, which is no favor to the Israelis, that they can act as they wish, that they are exceptional. They don't have to play by the rules of other nations. Thanks.
Those lines are not determined, but then the lines of Israel's borders are not determined either. And so are we talking about a legal issue, or are we simply, back to your principle that there's a question of political will, and part of the political will issue is at the court? Let me just quickly, my second question is, obviously, Palestine is the PLO, formally in international terms, but its existence is the PA. And if they go forward and try to press for prosecutions, Israel may well continue to cut off the tax revenues that are theirs under the Paris Protocol, but nevertheless, Israel cuts them off whenever they don't like what Palestine is doing. And the United States, the executive branch may not even have the power to keep funding the Palestinian Authority, because this Congress may just shut it off. Are you aware of anything that indicates that Abu Mazen has found a way through that thicket and to continued existence, or is it just, if you don't let me do this, it explodes?
Well, I think he has warned repeatedly that the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian Security Cooperation with the State of Israel, the whole Oslo structure is in jeopardy, and that the rest of the world cannot be assured that it's permanent. There are many Palestinians who advocate dropping that whole superstructure and changing their policy to demand equal rights, civil rights, and maybe even excluding voting rights at the beginning. That is a plausible way for the Palestinians to proceed. I'm not sure if it would be wise, but that's out there. As for aid, I don't think the U.S. is going to cut off its aid, nor do I think the Congress is going to force the hand of the president on this, because a cutoff of U.S. aid, in addition to the Israeli withholding of the 130 million annual VAT contribution, maybe more than that, a month, would shatter the Palestinian economy. There would be a terrible hardship, and for the Palestinian Authority to continue to function without that support is pretty unlikely. So I don't think the U.S. is going to do it. The Congress is not going to support it. I don't believe the state of Israel wants the U.S. to cut off its aid.
If I can just add one point to that, I think that the issue of the PLO versus the PA is a very crucial one. It's been handled incredibly badly at the United Nations, where you actually have a scenario where Palestinian president, right, is the president of the PA. He's not the president of the PLO. He's the chairman of the PLO. When he goes to the United Nations headquarters, he should always be addressed as Mr. Chairman. He is never addressed as Mr. Chairman. He's always addressed as Mr. President, which is his PA title, and is not, according to Oslo, the PA is supposed to have nothing to do with foreign affairs and negotiations. That belongs to the PLO. The PLO has not sufficiently reclaimed that. So it's hugely messy, and it's one of the reasons that it's a very growing tendency among a lot of Palestinians, both among Palestinian refugees and exiles and inside the occupied territory, to say we're better off with the collapse of the PA, because the PA, as a creation of Oslo, is primarily there to maintain order in the interest of the occupying authority. And if there was no money and the PA collapsed, Israel, as the occupying authority, would have no choice but to deal with direct control, which would make it, in certain ways, easier to think about negotiations and what the role and responsibility of the international community really needs to be. So it would be dramatic and drastic and painful for a lot of people, for sure, for a lot of Palestinians. But there are many who are saying that would actually be better than the current arrangement where the PA gets, it's about 100, well, it's been about 1.2 billion over 8 years, so that comes out to about $250,000, $300,000 a year from the U.S. in economic aid. Separately, $70 million a year of U.S. aid goes directly to train the Palestinian security forces, whose job it is to make sure that no Palestinians ever attack Israeli settlers or Israel. So for many Palestinians, they're just as happy to not have that be accessible.
Michael, as to your question about borders and the self-evident thesis that the West Bank is Palestine, I still think it presents a problem, and the court would be cautious about the kind of ingenious interpretation you've offered. Now, the Palestinians have a lot of smart lawyers as well as the Israelis, but I think the first thing the Israelis would say in rejecting that there is any accepted border between the two states is that part of the Palestinian Authority, at least nominally, is Hamas, and Hamas does not accept any Israeli sovereignty in the former British Mandate of Palestine.
That's not quite accurate, I think, Phil, because Hamas has said publicly that despite what their charter says, it's like despite what the Likud charter says, we will not support that there will not be any Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. But the Hamas has said publicly that they have given to the PLO the right to negotiate, including a long-term 99-year truce with Israel. So they do recognize, they do negotiate. And I think it's also a mistake to say that there is no border. The GA resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, including the one that recognized Palestinians as a non-member state, say in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, which is historically, including in resolutions the U.S. has signed and has supported, that's the borders of the occupied territory. So it's the occupied Palestinian territory in the UN definition that is now considered the Palestinian state.
Thank you for that clarification. We are running short of time, so we're going to accept four questions from the floor and then have our panelists answer them. So the lady in the beige sweater.
Thank you. It's actually mustard, but who's quibbling?
I don't see it.
Thank you very much. My name is Paulette Lee, and thank you very much for your presentations. In these discussions, and I've been to and had many of them, I think of, and this may make you laugh, but I think of Queen Elizabeth. When she visited Ireland, she said, and I'm paraphrasing her, she made an historic trip a few years ago, and she said, if only we had done something differently, or she rued the fact that there were things that had been done that shouldn't have been done. And I'm wondering that when you take a perspective from when this will end, what will have been done? Not so much the question of when, Ambassador, as you put it, but the what. Yeah. Thank you.
And then Mr. Tua in front. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Both speakers have said in different ways that these efforts at the UN are not likely to work. That's true. But they're also more than symbolic, and what they do is they force the Israelis to respond and, in a sense, to treat the Palestinian entity as an equal entity under international law. And then, of course, apart from all the legalisms and so on, there's the massive voice of international opinion and so on, which is very much on the Palestinian side. I do have a question, and the question is on the issue of recognition of a state based on its ability to control its border and so on. How would a Palestinian diplomat or you answer that critique, which is a relatively strong critique, although not all controlling?
Let's get a question from this side. Is there a question on this side?
Ambassador Wilcox, you did mention that the Palestinians should unify, and they did try that recently, and that the result was the most recent invasion of Gaza. So that's one point I wanted to make. And also, is it so difficult for the Europeans, who I think are fairly supportive of the Palestinian cause and try to help rebuild, is it that difficult for them to assert themselves? Vis-a-vis the U.S.
Why don't you decide which ones you answer, and I'll do the others.
Thank you. I know it's not technically not within today's topic, but even so, I wonder if the speakers could comment on the issue of the Netanyahu addressing the Congress, because I think there may be genuine differences between the U.S. and Israel regarding Iran, and that may play a role in this. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take a couple of them and then leave the rest to Phil. On the question of what will have been done when this is done, it will have been made too costly for Israel to continue its occupation and apartheid policies. And it will,
what?
I think BDS. We don't have time for more than that. On the question of why it's more than symbolism, Israel is waging a battle of legitimacy, and it's losing. And that battle, I think, has become the critical one in the continuation of this struggle overall. On the last question about the Netanyahu visit, I agree, it's a very important moment. This is actually, in some ways, perversely good news, because it's showing up both the partisan nature of this, partisan in the United States, partisan in Israel. This is all about the Israeli elections. But there is, as you say, a huge gap between the U.S. and the Israeli positions on Iran. Any of you who are interested, I've been speaking about this a lot the last few days. There's a bunch of YouTube and other videos. I was on MSNBC and Democracy Now! And stuff talking about this. The essence of this is that the U.S. position is that we will make sure Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. The Israeli position is not that. The Israeli position is we are making sure that Israel never has the capacity to make a... that Iran never has the capacity to build a nuclear weapon. Israel, as we know, already has nuclear weapons in the region. That Iran never has the capacity. And that's a far cry from actually getting one. There's a huge gap between those two positions. And John Kerry the other day actually lied about it when he said, Israel and the United States have the same goal, we just have some small differences on how to get there. Officially, they don't have the same goal. They have a very different goal. And it's that dispute that I think is very fundamental and is now becoming much more overt in the public discourse.
I'll address the question about Palestinian unity. Yes, they have tried. There was an encouraging agreement last year that they would try once again, and this time they would succeed, and that the need for unity was so overwhelming that they would put aside their internecine quarrel. They haven't. Hamas still governs Gaza. Mahmoud Abbas has never visited Gaza. And it's business as usual. And I believe that will continue until there is some glimmer of hope among Gazans and West Bank Palestinians that there's a chance to be liberated. There's a chance for a real state of their own, but that chance will not be fulfilled until they can get their own act together. It's not to say that a full-fledged unity government would immediately transform American, much less Israeli policy. The Israelis and the Americans, I'm very sorry to say, back in 2007 conspired to bring about the open and then violent split between Hamas and Fatah. We, in an effort to destroy Hamas, assumed that they could be overcome. We helped and supported Fatah militias in triggering that several days civil war in which Hamas won. Ben, your question about the ability of Palestinian Authority to control its own territory, I think it's relevant one. It's one that maybe the Israelis are loath to raise themselves in defense of their own policy, because the counterpart is that their territory is entirely controlled by Israel in a highly repressive military occupation. I think the long and short of it is that the UN General Assembly, representing the international community, has said that Palestine is a non-member state, and that was a major historic change, and I think that's all that it takes.